Welcome back to the Max Hack podcast, where we awaken together and share our greatest gifts with the world. This is part 3 on the late stages of awakening with researcher Luciano Melo. And in this last part of this series, Luciano is going to share more about his experiences in the 2 last stages of this map of awakening in Omni Integration and Post-Omni Integration. We're also going to talk about a potential relationship to the Buddhist concept of the 10 feathers and how do we actually make sense of these models of awakening and consciousness. Welcome back, Luciano.
Thank you, Max. I'm very excited to be here.
In part 2, we kind of stopped at the Omni Integration, so I would say let's start there again and walk us through Omni Integration and Post-Omni Integration and what's your experience with that?
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think it's good to have a caveat that these labels, they are still like working labels. Because every time something new happens or, some development, new development happens, we try to really see if those labels still fit or not, right? So it's always something very dynamic. It's never something like very static and we know for sure everything that it's in, So also have in mind that this is something that I normally discuss with Rasto, which is another researcher in terms of awakening, in terms of this process of awakening or enlightenment or whatever you want to call it. So these labels are really only working labels. Let's have this caveat, right? And especially because when it gets more, we cannot call the end because there's possibly never an end to anything, right? But it feels like an entire process has ended. That it's one of the markers of these late stages. Let's say you have this sense throughout the continuum, and I suppose you had and everybody has that you are transitioning from one stage to another, right? And when I say transitioning, what do I mean by that? I mean by every time that perception in relation to reality changes, right? For example,
it's a good definition.
Yeah. So let's imagine, for example, before awakening, what is the way you perceive reality, right? It's very three-dimensional. There is a subject and an object. They are very separate, right? You are not a tree. You don't feel separate from the environment, right? And everything is solid.
You feel separate from the environment.
Exactly. It's the other way around.
And then I want to mention again in the part 1 that in the beginning, we had this disclaimer about language and that we talk about the actual experience. So I think this is a nice addition, what you're just adding there.
We're not talking really about philosophy. We are not talking about conceptualization or intellectualization of anything. We are talking about, okay, how do you perceive reality, right? That is the question. So obviously, at least for me, even though I had a lot of knowledge regarding energies, regarding out-of-the-body experiences, my daily experience of reality was, okay, I'm separate from the environment. There is a three-dimensional world, even though I understand there were other dimensions, because of course, out-of-the-body deals with other dimensions, right? But so when the first shift happens, it's when we call transition. You transition to another kind of perception, another way in which you understand reality to be, or yourself to be even. So that is what I mean by transitioning or shifting, right? And what normally people understand about what it's awakening, it's a shift in this perception. I'm not as separate, right, from the environment. The environment is not as three-dimensional how I used to think it was. So that there are changes in the way in which you relate to other things.
Right. I want to add that For example, in the works of Daniel P. Brown or some of the books by Dustin D. Perner, they also call this vantage point development. Like, what's your vantage point from which you see the world? And I really like this word, vantage point, because it makes a lot of sense.
I like it too. And at the same time, you will see that in the end, there's no vantage point. And that is the thing that is more striking about the late stages. The vantage point goes away completely. Because even in a very late stage, even though the person thinks there is no separation between subject and object, there's always like a vantage point.
Someone is still witnessing.
Someone is still witnessing. It's not the same witness as it was in the beginning, that it's very clear that there is this witness witnessing something, right? So normally what happens in the first shift, usually what people describe is this, oh my goodness, there is the spaciousness, right? There is the feeling that things arise in this container of experience.
There would be like, let's say, location 2, what you're talking about right now.
We can call it location 2, but regardless of a more Jeffrey Martin matrix language, normally, usually, if, of course, you can transition to any kind of stage, right? There are books, for example, describing people who basically never really thought about awakening or never done anything related to meditation, and suddenly they are in non-existence. So it's a big jump, right? And the bigger the jump, the more disorienting will be the experience, because it's completely different from the experience of feeling that you're separate, that there is a world, an outer world and an inner world, right?
I think that's what kind of is also part of the benefit of having these maps or these models that we discuss, because you can kind of relate to, okay, where am I? And okay, maybe I'm going to the next step, stage, location, whatever you call it. But then it's not so different from where I am now when I'm going like step by step.
Sometimes it is. Sometimes, even though, because it's interesting that there are lots of benefits of knowing more or less what happens, right? And one of the big questions that Russell and I have been asking is do people really go more or less through the same kind of progression? That is a big question, right? To be answered.
That's super interesting. What is your finding with your like smaller research group that you have?
We've been talking to people like in a more informal way, and now we're gonna start like a formal really research, not only about this, but a lot of things related to awakening. And we discovered that yes, it seems to be the case, let's say, that independently on whether you follow a Buddhist tradition or another kind of tradition, or even a more secular tradition, the stages through which people go through are more or less the same. So it usually starts with this feeling that spaciousness, I don't even know if I'm different from the environment, right? Because it's non-dual. There is this sense that things are arising in this space instead of the world the way it is, right? There is like a sensation that you are much more than you thought you were. You are more boundless, right? You are not inside of a body all the time. So these things are really hallmarks of a classic kind of transition. And especially if it lasts. Of course, you can have a glimpse of that, right? That can last 1 hour, 2 hours, or 1 day or 2 days, but sometimes it lasts months or even years, right? The person really doesn't come back to the same kind of perception that it was before. So in terms of transition, that's what I was talking about. Even in the end, it has a sense that transitions will not happen anymore. That kind of stark transition from one kind of perception to a different kind of perception, right? Now I'm perceiving things in a certain way, and then suddenly, oh my goodness, there's a shift. It's completely different. And it's good to also say that it's impossible for the mind to try to come up with what comes next. It's really impossible, because this is not related to time space. This is not related to concepts that the mind can use, right? It's outside of the realm of duality, let's say. It's outside of the realm of language, and language is inherently dualistic. You have to put things in a box, right? They exist or they don't exist. It's empty or it's full. It's blah, 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 blah. And this is something that it happens, or that's another question. Does it really happen? But regardless, this is something that happens outside the realm of time space. That's why it's so hard for the mind to try to understand even what comes next. And to me, throughout this journey, it was always a surprise. Even though if someone like me, for example, come and say, oh, the next phase is like this, you will create like a conceptual, right, map in your head of what Luciano said or what anybody else said. And when you transition, they say, oh my goodness, I would never have imagined that. It's impossible. Right? It's always this way. And that's why it sometimes also creates problems, because the map says this, but my experience is this. So we are also trying to figure out the ways in which people conceptualize those stages. Because there are core elements, right? They are part of the stage, let's say. But there are different ways in which the people relate to that stage, which words they will use. Do I feel that, or do I feel something else? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So just a quick share from my first transition, because I basically, if I sensed it right, I wasn't in fundamental well-being or awakening. And I transitioned to this new feeling where I felt fundamentally well, and there was a lot of love and joy. So I thought, cool, now I transition to what on Jeffrey's map is location 1. And then I spoke with one of the mentors in the community, Sanjay, and I told him my experience, and he was like, congratulations, you're in location 3. I was like, what, really? I thought like I read like location 1, that sounded like what I'm experiencing. And then I read location 3 and I was like, no, right, yeah, actually that's what I'm feeling. So, right, like language can be so, it's kind of hard to grasp actually, to what words you put on it.
It feels divine, right? And some people are in the same kind of stage and will say something a little bit different. It depends on how you feel it, how you conceptualize that experience, which concepts are in your brain, right? Because you need concepts in order to explain to someone else. So which concepts you're really going to use, or which baggage you have in order to explain what is happening. So the way you feel, it's going to be completely different. Not completely different. Again, the core elements need to be there in order for someone be able to recognize, right? And say, oh, you are in this stage. And we know that location 3, for example, it's a very classic stage in any kind of awakening development, in which some people call unity consciousness, right? The feeling that you are always uniting to something bigger than you, to nature, to God, to the universe, to the flow of the cosmos. You always feel that vastness, right? That how big it is, and you are united to that. You are that. But it's interesting to notice as well that the I am is still there, right? Because it's usually I am the universe.
There's sort of this feeling that divine love is there, but flowing through this subject.
Exactly. There is something there that it's not me, and I can unite to that. Like I feel united to that. Again, not only the observer is there, right? The witness of the experience is there, but there is a sense that there is something still separate from me, that it's bigger than me, that it's, right?
I mean, it feels pretty close and intimate, but it's still separate. Yeah.
It still is. And of course, again, every time you transition to something new, then you realize that there was a separation. Or, oh my goodness, right? That there was still an observer, or there was still an I, or there was still some level that it was not really united or one, let's say. So it's always like this. Many of the things people notice, and myself included, when it's not there anymore, right? When there is something missing. And that's another classic thing that not usually, but most of the time happens in a transition. Sometimes you miss something that was there and you took for granted because it was part of your daily experience. And then suddenly the self, let's say, seems to have dropped away. And it feels sometimes even really like there is part of yourself, even the body, that it's missing. There is a hole, you know? Whole not with WH, whole with age O. There is something that it's not there anymore. And that also what creates the idea that things are falling away, which is not the case. In the end, really, things come back. So you're not gonna end up without any self-structure, otherwise you wouldn't be able to function.
Otherwise, you would not be in the podcast speaking right now.
Exactly. You would be in bed, like, being unable to speak or do anything. But it really feels like, oh my goodness, that fell away. That is not here anymore. So we have to understand that throughout this process, the first big stage, at least it feels that way, it's a process of disintegration. It's a process of disconnecting from all the filters in which you see reality. It's a process of disconnecting from identities. It's a process of disconnecting from the ego and self, but it doesn't mean that they will go away forever. It means that the relationship with that structure, it's going to be different, right? And then that is something important. So before we go over models and all this kind of thing, let's talk more about the last stages, let's say. And I'm being completely honest here. We don't know if those are the last stages. Who knows? We are still going through. Like, if we had this podcast 2 months ago, I would say, yeah, I mean, the way it feels, it's the last stage, and then there was something else. So yeah.
So tell us more about what the last stage was before and what the last stage is now, from your perception.
In terms of progression, that's what I said, that it feels like first there is this big disintegration. And you feel, well, where this is going to end? To nothingness, right? And it really ends in nothingness. It gets to a point in which you don't feel that there is a subject, right? Or a self. And the world is just an illusion. It's not really here. Concepts are not here. So it really ends, let's say, in this kind of what we call non-existence, because it feels that nothing really exists. Even though you can say, yeah, but can you see that there is an apartment around you? Yeah, but it's not really here. It's just an illusion. And it feels real that it's that way, right?
It feels real that it's an illusion.
It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
For another person, it feels real that it exists, right? So that is another characteristic of the beginning. You feel that you exist and there is something else outside of you that also exists. When you get to the highest point, let's say, or the highest low, whatever you want to call it, of non-existence, you don't exist and nothing outside of you exists, because even there is no difference between inside and outside. That kind of separation already fell away earlier, right, in the process. And then, of course, when in that moment, it's really hard for the mind to understand what could come next. And when I was in non-existence, I really thought, okay, I will have to cope with this because it's going to be this way forever. What else could exist, right? It feels like you got to the bottom of something, a bottom of reality, but it's not the case really. Then really starts a process of reintegration. And then it's when, for example, you realize, oh, all the dimensions that I thought had gone away, like potentiality, like actuality, right? I can perceive them again. But it's more like a vantage point. That's why I like this concept as well, and I used a lot. It feels like you have like a meta point of view, and you can see from that meta point of view that all of those dimensions that you thought had gone away, they are still there. But you are not related intimately with them. You are, like, from that point of view, you can perceive that they exist, or they seem to exist, let's say. Right? And you can engage with them again, but it's not the same way. And that's what it's important in this process. That the level of identification is what changes. So you can engage, for example, again with the present moment, but never in a way that it feels real again. It doesn't fool you anymore, you know what I mean? So you engage with that knowing that that is just a conceptualization. That is just an idea. It doesn't mean that it's really happening. and that is the change. So you can, at this point, it almost like everything is kind of separate, right? There is this dimension and this dimension, but when you get close to the end of this phase, even the body becomes another dimension, and it's really striking not having a body at all. But you can tell that there is that layer that it is an idea, as a thought of a body, and you engage with that, but you are never that anymore. You know, so this is part of the process, this engagement with those dimensions, to the point that you can engage with them again, but without having a deep identification with them. And that's why everything changes, right? Because if you know you are playing like a character in a play, of course you're kind of, the way in which you understand that play, it's different, right? You are not gonna be so attached to all of those things because you know it's something that is almost like a creation, let's say.
I wonder if what I experienced on ayahuasca 1.5 years ago, if that was like a glimpse of what you're describing, because my experience, like on the come down of ayahuasca, was that I was sitting in the garden and nothing existed, but I would look at the tree, and while I was looking at the tree and I had the thought, oh, that's a tree, then the tree would appear like with polygons, like little parts, suddenly would build a tree. I was like, wow. So I think there is a tree, and then the tree appears, and I would look at the house. The house didn't exist, but I thought, there's the house, and then it appears. And in my mind, I was like, what if like everything in the universe just exists because 8 billion people agree that this is a tree, and everybody thinks that this is a tree, and that's why it exists. That was like my question and my experience on the come down.
Experience, yeah, that is related to both non-existence and potentiality. Because when you are in those stages, for example, when I was in between potentiality and non-existence, I would feel that only the things that I looked at would build themselves and exist, let's say. Because out of nothingness, there is this field of potentiality, right? So there is potential to exist basically anything you can imagine. But out of the field of potentiality, let's say, a tree comes because there is like a quote unquote subject, right? Oh, there is a tree, and then the tree is there. It's so automatic, obviously, that you don't realize that you need to believe that there is a body in order for the body to exist. I know it's crazy to say that, but those, for example, when I was by the end of totality, in which the body was just a layer on top of reality, it really felt like it was just an idea. And I believed in that idea on a daily basis. And then the body really existed for me. You know what I mean? So yeah, you definitely had a real experience. I think a lot of people have real experiences when they use any kind of psychedelics or anything like this. It doesn't mean though that the person will transition to that location or to that region or to that phase, but it's real, and it changes a little bit the way you perceive reality, right? Because you can doubt it, but you say, okay, now I know more or less that it could be true.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, it really, because ayahuasca felt so fucking real. It felt like the realest thing, like more real as third dimension reality before I awakened. So there was definitely a sense of, that felt so real. Like, what if there is this illusion that this is the physical world is so real, but actually there are so many other things real. And definitely in my life, that really unfolded into awakening in many different ways afterwards. So for me, yeah, it was a nice glimpse. And then, but I think then it was also good that I did the 45 days course again and did the 1 hour meditation.
When that happens, you're gonna be able to really go deeper into that, because it already happened once, you know. So because every time you go to a new region or new phase, of course it opens up a lot of new possibilities of exploration, right? It doesn't mean that on day one you're gonna understand everything and blah 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 about that specific phase. But if you already had glimpses before, you can really go deep into that phase faster, because the conceptualization of that part was already done, let's say.
Have you ever tried out or heard about experiences about DMT and 5-MeO DMT?
So we've been talking to a lot of people, right? And obviously people try everything basically. I've never tried myself. I think I would have if I felt that I needed a booster, for example. But I never did. So unfortunately it's always secondhand, let's say. But that's why I'm saying that it feels like, so some people when they tell what happened, it's really real, because we know, right? I know because I've been there. So I know that what they are saying is real. It really happens in a particular phase, let's say, or a stage.
To which stage would you relate that? To non-existence?
What you told me?
Yeah, 5-MeO DMT. I mean, like what people share about that.
No, so any kind of psychedelic can pull you in, or can you have an experience in any kinds of those. It doesn't have to be necessarily non-existence or potentiality. People may have experiences in potentiality in which they are looking at things and it could be anything, right? You look at a tree and you say, okay, but it could be a dog. Why it's a tree? That is clear that it's potentiality. Or even, for example, another example in potentiality is that time and space doesn't really make sense in a linear way. There is a past, a present, and then a future, right? So you can access things from the past or things from the future, and it feels like now. that is clear that it's potentiality. Potentiality happens a lot of this kind of phenomena. And some people also have experiences in pure non-existence. Nothing exists, I don't exist, right? Concepts don't exist. It's just that you cannot even say that it's vast, because vastness doesn't exist, but it feels like nothingness. You know? And then that's what I'm saying. The progression is, okay, I can look back. Let's say it feels almost like you are turning around in a way. And then you see, oh my goodness, potentiality is still there. The actual moment is still there. A body is still there. All the identities are still there. They didn't go away. And that is what I call totality. They are still there. They kind of work together, but you still kind of perceive them separately. And there is that meta point of view, right? So the next phase is the phase in which all of that kind of combines. That's why we nickname Omni Integration, because all of the things that were separate, or all of the things that your mind understood as opposite concepts, they come together. So, for example, when you are in non-existence, you feel, oh my goodness, there is no self, period, right? And you see a lot of people saying, there is no self, period. But when you are in this process of Omni Integration, there is a return from all of the things that you left behind. So there is even a return of the sense of being human again. So there is a return of the self, let's say. There is a return of agency even. But things are integrating. You cannot tell the difference between agency and non-agency anymore. You know what I mean? It feels like there is, but it's not.
I don't know what you mean, because it's unimaginable for my mind.
And some people say, oh, I understand, they coexist. No, there is the first part, they coexist, but then you start seeing, okay, but the question may come, is agency different than no agency? And you cannot find the difference anymore. So you think, okay, there is, but there isn't. And people say, are you human? Yes and no. You're human and no human, because human and no human is not different from each other. Right? Is there a body? Yes, but no. So it's the end kind of thing. It's really hard to explain, obviously, for someone who hasn't been there. But I started to, the first thing that I started to perceive when this phase happened, and I forgot to tell, before this phase happens, really, there is a sense that you found something really fundamental to everything. That's why I call it primordial force. That brings again a sense of beauty, a sense of something divine, but very delicate. It's nothing thick like location 5. It's like pure crystal water, but that feels like permeates everything, right? And it feels that force is forcing things to go to one, not to be dualistic anymore. Right? So all of the things that are still dual, and you don't even notice that they're still dual, they start to combine.
I wanna jump in here and talk about language and words again, because what you just described, that there's the crystal clear water, there's non-dual, everything is one, and you said that feels like this underlying truth, primordial force. At the same time, I feel you could use these descriptions for what I am feeling now in location 5, and you could probably use the same words in location 2. And these are the words that I hear in my own Buddhist lineage and the Buddhist teacher that I follow. So, and there seems to be like this circle where the descriptions come back over time, over different stages.
And when we're going to talk more about models, the way I understand it, at least, it's the process always goes from one side to the other. Imagine that it's a spiral, okay? And you are the spiral in the beginning is really superficial. And the sides of the spiral are life and everything that is related to life, divinities, the subject, the I, right? Phenomenology, light. And there is this other side that is the empty side. There is the no life side. There is the nothingness side. Is the side that is much more structural. It's not about content. Right? And so if you think of in the beginning, it really goes, not even in the beginning, all the way down. It really goes that way. You go to what Jeffrey would call location 2, that it's perceiving that there is this container, right? And things arise inside the container. So you are on the more empty side, the very superficial part of the empty side, right? And then you go to unity consciousness, or what we call location 3. That is the very superficial part of life itself. So you feel life everywhere, right? Everything is full, everything is multidimensional, because what? You are relating to phenomenology, all kinds of things, light, energy, content, life itself, nature. So you go to what Jeffrey would call location 4, right? You go to a layer down, let's say, into the depth of emptiness. So it's very flat. There is the first moment in which you really realize that agency is not there anymore, right? There is not a lot of phenomena. There is no sense that there is life anywhere, right? It's very empty in a way, but you wouldn't use the word emptiness in location 4. And then you go to 5. In 5, what happens? Every time you go down in terms of the life side, there is more light, there is no difference between you and everything else, right? We even talked in our last conversation about how you move your arm, there is a blur of the movement, but because the distinctions are falling away. You are the environment, and you feel deeply that, and you can see that things are made of light almost, but it's still kind of superficial. So you see that every time you go through the spiral, you go to a deeper, that it's at a deeper level, you go into a deeper level, and at the same time, they have more or less, you could say, more or less the same characteristics, right? You are still dealing with life, with light, with content, with the feeling of energy. So I even noticed, for example, we haven't talked about this at all, but the moment in which my sexuality was much more active was related to the life side. It was not related to the empty side. On the empty side, I didn't want to have sex. There was no interest, And then you go to the life side, you feel energized again, and everything is beautiful. But the important thing is to notice that these two things, they are part of reality. One is not better than the other. We tend to prefer the fuller side, like that everything is made out of light. There is joy and happiness. But it's impossible to exist one side without the other. It's not going to happen. Even though some people have a tendency, we discovered talking to people, to go more to one side than the other. Sometimes they go deep into the life side and they really brush off the other side, or the other way around. Some people are really into the empty side. So they have these differences, but it doesn't matter. So when you're really talking about the primordial force, that is this force that seems to force for you to see that things are not separate, that that's an illusion, right? That they've never been separate in the first place. It was always the mind who created separation. It feels like you are coming back to location 2, because there is a feeling that the human is back, right? And that feeling is the feeling that you feel in location 2. You don't feel a lot in location 3. You don't feel a lot in location 4 even, right? Because the process of disintegration is happening. So the feeling that of being human, being an agent in the world, being separate from something else, it's falling apart. And then suddenly there is a feeling of someone in the world again. It's really weird. For me, it was really weird. And I really thought I'm going backwards in the beginning. Of course, then you can see that there's a lot of other characteristics that are not specifically from the beginning. Everything is much more profound, much more delicate. It's not shallow anymore. And another thing that happens that it's really interesting, that meta point of view that you had and seeing different dimensions, that goes away, because those dimensions, they combine in one thing. That's called its Omni Integration, right? They integrate. So you cannot say, oh, I'm gonna go back to stage X or phase X or location X. They become available without the need to go there. You know what I mean? Go there, it's like quote unquote. And that is a big difference, right? I felt freedom. And that's why in this phase there is a sense that something ended. Like, oh, I don't need to transition to one thing to another, right? And I have access to everything. All the qualities related to stage X, Y, or Z, they are available now. All the emotions become available again. And that's why, and that phase really was long for me, because my process was really fast in comparison with other people, right? In 1.5 years, all of this happened. So this process, it felt like, okay, there's nothing really new happening in terms of shifting, in terms of perception of reality.
How long did you stay in Omni Integration?
So it depends on how you define Omni Integration. I will define it depends. Right, so it started really to me in February of 2023. And it really changed drastically by the end of December. So it was almost a year. And for me, that is like 10, 20 years. It was the first time that I really, I can see things are deepening, but there is no shift in terms of how things are perceived or how things show up, right? So throughout this process, I noticed that I thought, how could I believe in locations and phases? Because everything is one, right? And everything is available. And then started much deeper, but it already started a little bit earlier as well. I couldn't tell the difference again between self and no-self, the difference between form and formlessness, between fullness and emptiness. They were the same thing to me. And one day I was walking, I think I told this story, and came to my mind, are you dead or alive? And I couldn't tell the difference, right? That to me was really another marker of this phase. So it feels like, okay, you really started your journey, right, from being human, and then you go back to that point and get the human back, let's say, and integrate those two things. All the journey before with all the journey of the awakening, and they become one. And I thought, okay, that's it. If you look at the 10 ox herder pictures, right? I don't know if people know about this.
I will show
I
it.
don't know. Yeah, I don't know anything deeply. Okay, so I really apologize if I say something completely wrong about them. But it really shows this process of starting from the beginning when you think you are human and you're separate from everything, right? And you go through all of this process and come back more or less to the same point. And they say that you are back to the marketplace. So you are back to humanity again, right? You can relate to everybody, and that's the way it feels. So to me, it made sense that that was more or less the end of it, right? And at the same time, you don't. At that point, you cannot really tell the difference between subject and object. So to me, that was resolved, but I didn't notice that there was still a little bit of the observer, and not only that, of 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 the knower, of someone who is knowing something and is defining something and it's controlling experience, right? So I couldn't notice. So
when was the time you noticed?
I think I told that as well, but I think it's good to say it again. So at this time I was having I was knowing more people and talking to more people. So I talked to people, for example, from the Fathers community, right? That use the Fathers model to get to the same point, let's say. And then I remember that I read stuff by Kevin Schla, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but I will let you know, and then you put the. He did an interview with Angelo about the Fathers, and he has a website that is Only the Scene, I think it's called.
Okay.
So he went through all of this process, and now he facilitates the Fathers model to other people, right? And I saw his interview. I thought it was really interesting because it really talked about stuff that to me happened in this phase, in this last phase. Sometimes I read a little bit about the Fathers and didn't match exactly the progression that I've been through, but this really talked about similar things that were happening in this Omni integration for me. And I thought, wow, they really talk about what we are talking. Especially the sense of, because when the human comes back, many times for a lot of people also comes back a lot of deconditioning that was left behind. Deep deconditioning. It's not the superficial stuff anymore. Sometimes related to deep trauma, sometimes related to whatever, past lives. And the first thing is like a reaction to that, right? You think, what is going on? Why this is back? I don't want this. So this is really related to restlessness, right? There is something that arises and say no or yes to something else. So there is a sense of restlessness.
Mm-hmm. And restlessness is one of the last feathers.
Is the ninth feather. Is the feather. But then, of course, during the process, more and more you realize that thing that is showing up, it's not different than anything else. It's not different than this. And the more you realize this, the more the restlessness diminishes, right? So you start even welcoming all of those things because you think, oh, good, another thing is being deconditioned. Wonderful. But it's still, there is something welcoming something else. That is the point for me. Mm-hmm. But when I read and when I got in contact with the Feather stuff, I thought, yeah, to me, it's exactly, I have Feathers 9 and 10 completely resolved because look, I'm not restless anymore, right? There is nothing that rises against anything. And at the same time, there is no way of knowing if there is self or no self because they are the same thing, right? So the not knowing, which is the Feather 10, which is ignorance, but it's much more not knowing, that is resolved as well. To me, it was done. And probably what it was done, it's the most superficial part of those feathers. So I realized that one night, and I apologize if I, again, telling the same story, but I think it's important to right? I don't know if you agree, Max.
No, I agree, and we released these 3 parts over 3 weeks. So people listen to part 2 maybe last week, they've forgotten the story already.
So I don't know what's going on. I went to the living room and then suddenly there was a sensation happening. That's a normal sensation of the body. Probably related to this kind of thing that I said, deconditioning. To me, it was like an energy in the gut, like a raw energy that would show up out of nowhere, and it was not related really to anything that was happening. And I think it was that, but I don't remember exactly what kind of sensation was. And the sensation happened, and the first thought that came to my mind was how I could possibly have thought that I could welcome or reject anything if there is no separation, right? And then the perception was the sensation happening by itself without anybody perceiving that. So it was like living the sensation, you know. That was really like a flash of understanding, or whatever you want to call it, like a realization, really. And that led to the next stages that are really related to subject and object. There was still a separation a little bit between subject and object. And then more and more sensations started to happen by themselves. There was nobody observing them. There was nobody feeling them. And it's really hard to describe how it is, right? Because I am describing them. So it really feels like this. It feels that there's nothing attached to that experience. So you cannot say anymore, I have a sensation. It's the sensation that is having itself, let's say. It's living itself.
So I want to ask you about your personal experience, because we delayed this interview because you had some, pain in the body. Maybe you could share about how that was perceived then.
Very instrumental for this. Because what happened is that I was in that process of welcoming the conditioning, right? And then what happened is that I had like sciatica, like very intense pain. And then I discovered that I have 2 disc bulges in the spine, pressuring 2 different nerves. So it's a complicated thing. So it's not only the back, there is like numbness on the leg. But in the beginning, there was really a lot of pain. So since I was used to trying to perceive any kind of deconditioning, that raw energy, as nothing different than this, I started doing the same thing with the pain. So it got to the point in which there was no difference between the pain and equanimity. To me, those things stopped making sense. And I know that it's hard, because even though there was pain, let's say, in a relativistic level, they were immediately perceived as equanimity. So it's hard to explain, I understand that. So I think that exercise, that was not even something that I read somewhere, and I was doing, really helped for this merge, or not even a merge, but for the illusion that there was something separate to fall away. Right? From a relative point of view, there was a merging happening. There was an integration happening between subject and object. From an absolute point of view, it's more like, oh, there is an illusion that continues to exist, and there's still a little bit left, that there is something separate. That there is an object feeling something, right? So I think that that having pain really helped me in processing this and understanding that there is nothing separate from anything else, and there's nothing different from anything else either. It's only a perceptual glitch, let's say, a misperception, better saying. So what started happening is things started happening by themselves more and more and more and more, until the point in which it felt like really there was no difference between the subject and object, right? And that is when the shift happened. So to me, there was no shifts left to happen. I was completely okay, let's say, in Omni. So this is a new shift. Why? Because it brings a different kind of interpretation, or things are in a completely different way that they were before. So if you think, oh, okay, there is no difference between object and subject, what are the consequences of that? Can you imagine the consequences?
I guess it influences all of life.
Everything. Because the observer is not there, the controller is not there. So there is nobody to know whether something is happening, right?
So how do you know right now you're doing a podcast with me?
It seems to be the case. You know? That's all I know. That it seems to be the case that an interview or a podcast is happening, a conversation is happening. But the more it goes deep into this, the less the certainty. And that is related to not knowing, right? It's related really to feather 10, the 10th feather. But I had understood, I think some people even have a very superficial understanding of this, what it means not knowing. Because it's not like, oh, it's impossible to know because it's very complex. So how would you know if there is pure consciousness in which an entire universe arises, right? But it's not related to complexity, it's related to the impossibility of knowing, because the subject falls away. And when the subject falls away, the object falls away together, because they are one, right? There's no difference between them. So it feels always that nothing is really arising, but it's much more not knowing whether something arises or not. So that is the biggest difference from non-existence. Non-existence, you say, yeah, it feels that there is a word, but there is not. So you have like a no answer, right? So in this case now is much more, I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know if there is something happening. And it's funny because I had again. It becomes really weird to say I had, because, it feels like nobody's having anything, or if there is someone having something, it's not Luciano, it's not myself. It's happening by itself. But I went to bed 2 nights ago, and what always here is this, I don't even know how to explain. It feels like deep sleep, or it feels like the liminal space between being awake and between asleep, that thing, which nothing really happens sometimes. So I lay down, and that was that. There was nobody perceiving anything. That was it. And then suddenly my husband moved in bed because he was in the bed sleeping. And there was, again, it's similar to the experience you had with the tree. Immediately, an entire universe showed up in which there was a Luciano having a relationship with another guy, in this case, right? And they were sleeping in the same bed. and there was a relationship between them, and there was a room. It was like this. But even so, when the scene was happening, the scene was happening by itself. There was no subject. There was just a perception of a scene in which there was someone called Luciano having a life, and in that case, it was related to Bill and blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean?
How is your perception of sleeping or dreaming?
That changed. That has been changing now because of not know. Sometimes I'm walking and I have to think, am I awake really? Because it feels like sleeping. But it's not feels like sleeping in a sense of unconsciousness. It feels like sleeping in a way that you cannot really keep reflecting about yourself because the subject is not there. Is it clear?
It's of course hard to imagine.
Yeah, it's not like walking on the street completely unconscious.
Yeah.
You know, it's much more. Yeah, with the subjectivity gone, you don't know. It gets to a point that you don't know even if there are senses capturing sensory data. And I know it's impossible to explain. I'm really sorry about that. Especially because I think it's something new, right?
Right.
But the feeling is that, oh my goodness, everything that came before was an illusion. There has never been a separation. So even like integration or reintegration or disintegration never happened, you know? But at the same time, I understand that at least most of people, they need to go through a process to get to the point of perceiving that the process never existed. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that this is the what I'm saying is the right thing or correct, because I don't even know. Right?
But it's your experience and apparently the experience of a couple of other people.
Of other people, we have a group that we call the Omni group, in which people are more or less in these stages as well. Kevin is one of the members of the group. Kevin, the guy, the fatter guy.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it matches more or less but it's funny that like a month ago I would say, yeah, I know what you're talking about, Kevin. Or I know what you're talking about, whatever, whoever is in the group that it was in the stage. Because it really felt like there was no subject and subject. So that's what I'm saying, that things are much more perceived when they cease to exist. In hindsight, in retrospect. Because then it changes so drastically that you say, oh my goodness, now if someone asks me, for example, one of the differences, when I was in the previous stage, it was, oh, do you feel human, Luciano? Well, I feel human and no human, but human and no human are the same thing. That would be my answer, right? Now, the concept human doesn't make sense. It's the concept itself. What do you mean by being human? Do you mean, for example, if I ask you, Max, what does it mean to be human? What are the characteristics?
Yeah, it's also not so easy to answer for me.
Because when the human came back, when the sense of being human came back in the previous phase, was this sense that there was an agency back in a way, but was not different than having no agency, right? So it feels like, yeah, there is this subject in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But now you can ask me, do you feel non-human? I don't know. I don't know what non-human is.
Yeah.
Because there's no sense for the concept, like what is human or non-human.
Yeah, and there is no one to know.
And who's the subject to know or decide on that?
Whether there is a human or non-human, right? That this is not dysphoric in any way. It's not something that you feel negative.
Mm-hmm.
It is disconcerting in the beginning because everything changes again, right? The way things show up change completely. So in the beginning, there was a feeling of not being in control because exactly the control is dying. The one who controls everything is dying. So you feel you're losing control, right? But then when you lose control, you lose control. So the sense, if there is a sense, because I don't know, it's like you are never concerned about anything because, you know, the feeling of past and future and even the present is completely gone. I was talking to a person and I said, time is really gone, right? And she said, yeah, it's incredible that time is even goner. So it's really hard to think about a concept of yesterday or tomorrow. It doesn't make sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
And before, even though there was no sense of past and future, I could think about the concept of yesterday and there was something there.
Yeah.
Now I do this movement even because of the movement I would do to remember the past. There's nothing.
And yeah, but you're still able to look in your calendar and schedule, for example, this podcast.
Calendar is the only marker that will tell me that, yeah, conceptually, that means future. But there is no feeling attached whatsoever that there is a future.
Okay. I think now you shared so much about the last stages. Because a lot of people who will listen to this podcast is really spiritual seekers who haven't even, awakened to the first stages of this. So I would like to ask you if you have any advice for people, that are still seeking. What do you think would be a good advice, or what is something that seekers, not yet finders, not yet awakened, what are they missing? Maybe there's like one takeaway for them that they could integrate in their life.
Yeah, independently, Max, it will always feels like there is a huge effort in the beginning. I think that is independently of anybody, right? I was not a person who really, someone said something and then suddenly I was awakened. I had really to sit, I had really to do the practices, right? I had really to find the practices that fit my kind of personality. So that is the first thing. Don't think just because you are in a certain tradition and they will give you, oh, this is the practice that you should do. If the practice is not helping, if you don't see any improvement, or if you don't start having non-dual experiences, find another practice. So that to me is really important. That's the number one thing. The number two thing is sinking in. That is a very important practice. So it doesn't matter if you have an understanding that it's superficial or not about this. Get the first thing that shows up. For example, let's imagine that you sit and it becomes clear that there is this field behind you, or in the background, let's say. That is a field without really qualities, that it's always there, it's very stable. Sink into that. What it means sink in? It means, oh, okay, it's like laying going in a pool and let your body sink into that, right? Relaxing into that feeling. So that you can do that all over the continuum. So what is it? Let's imagine that you call that awareness, that I used to call. Okay, so now I'm sinking to awareness. Let's imagine that the next thing that happens you call the infinite, that I used to call. Sink into the infinite, you know? It doesn't matter what is. It could be silence. Silence is a very good one. It could be stillness. That is the same thing as silence, actually. So let's imagine that you are in location 3 even, and there is joy. Sink into the joy. See what happens. So it's let yourself go. It's surrender to that.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, that was a very important practice that I continue doing. But in the beginning, again, before really the shift happens, it feels like, oh my goodness, it's a lot of effort. And one day I have a very good sitting, let's say, if you sit to practice, and the next day is horrible. My mind is all over the place. It's always going to be that way. And then it gets to a point in which there is a shift. You become more stable into that, let's say. And then you're going to start feeling that there is like a resistance to something other than that. Sink into the resistance. Feel the resistance. Or let's imagine that you are like in the beginning and then you have an experience that you know that it's deeper because it's nothing that you experienced before, right? So you know that it's something new. Try to remember the next day how it felt. Try to sink into that feeling. That will pull you to that new thing. And then it really gets to the point in which the gravity pull of that, it's so strong that there's nothing to be done, really. You just need to let go of resisting. Right? That's the only thing left to do. Because you will know like that is calling you even. That's the way I felt. I felt that silence was calling me. That it felt so good to be into silence, but at the same time, I knew what's gonna happen if I go there, you know? So there is the always the mind think, yeah, but what if destroys your life? What is you're gonna, complicate things? Your relationship will end. You're gonna lose your job. So yeah, all of the thoughts will come, and then just think, okay, that's just a thought, and give yourself to it, surrender to it, and then the magnetism is so strong that will do the job. And it really gets to the point in which you feel that has a life of its own. It's completely independent of whether you want it or not. Right? You can fight, you can do whatever you want, but it's inevitable. And another thing that I want to say is that in terms of models, in terms of how this process happens, depending on the variables that you choose, it will create a model. So let's imagine, for example, I talked a lot in the previous two conversations about actuality, potentiality, and non-existence, right? Those are models that the top variables that build the model are much related to time and space. So why it's called actuality? Because it's the way time and space are perceived. Right? So the question is, how much of the past and the future are completely gone? There is really for you only the present moment, right? And then, of course, if you go to potentiality, time and space become really different. right? Even I said the potentiality, for example, right? You can go to the past, to the future, and it feels like now. Or even the space, the way things are built start to really fall apart. So it could be anything else. So the space variable is changing, right? It's become malleable. It's not as solid as it is in the beginning. But for example, another way of understanding this that I talked a little bit today is using the variables of life and no life, or fullness and emptiness. They are the same thing. Form and formlessness, and that creates like a spiral model, right? You go first to life, then you go to emptiness, then you go deeper into life, deeper into emptiness, deeper into life, deeper, and that until everything becomes really one instead of separated. So it's like a spiral that goes. So those are the things related to models. It doesn't mean that sometimes one model is better than the other. It's just the way they were organized, let's say. Right?
Yeah.
But independently, it seems to be the case that in a very like a overarching thing, it feels like first really is this integration. All of these elements, time and space and self and whatever you want to put there, they are disintegrating into nothingness, and then come reintegration until the point that it really becomes one at the end, right? In which subject and object are not really separate anymore. So that seems to be the overall progression, let's say.
Yeah.
But within that, of course, there are, again, personal tendencies that play out. People will perceive one thing in a certain way, and the other person will perceive that same thing in a different way. But if you look at it in a certain angle, there are elements there that they can agree on, let's say.
If you enjoyed this interview with Luciano Melo, check out the video here, more podcasts on awakening, and you can also find the links of different things that we mentioned in the description here. Sending you much love.